Was it Thursday or Friday when we woke up to hear that the world has changed, that we had to open the news on the internet and to see Cameron, not this one, the sad one, resigning from office? And what was it, Friday or Saturday, when we heard about this horrible train accident in India that killed over 200 people? And it didn't really happen, but it could have, right? And the Bituach Leumi. I mean, if you're lucky enough to be a foreigner and you don't know what the Bituach Leumi is, it's the National Insurance Institute. And again, if you're lucky enough not to know what it is, it's a bit similar to the biblical story of Job. Basically, God and Satan sitting together having a bet. And well, I'm probably deviating, but this morning I got a letter from them, the same way I get for every year in the past 7 years, telling me that I have a debt, meaning I owe them money. And this is all based on the fact that they think that I'm a stay-at-home mom. And really, I'm willing to do everything to prove the National Insurance Institute that I'm not a mom. And I could go on, probably on and on, about how every morning that I wake up, I have 3 kids jumping on my head and traffic and whatnot. But basically, this just to give some background about the fact that, you know, we're living in a world that makes me so happy that I'm dealing with computers. Because, you know, I open up the console, I start my day, everything is so calm, no surprises, you have full control, you can do whatever. Oh, fuck. Anyway. So my name is Amitai Burstein. Amitaibu is my Twitter handle and GitHub. And in the past 7 years, I have been a stay-at-home mom. Not really. I have been the CTO and co-owner of Gizra. It's a web development shop based in Tel Aviv. We're 20 people in Tel Aviv and 2 in the US. We have some fancy clients like Harvard University and the European Commission and the UN and so on and so forth. But the reason I'm standing here is because we are using Elm in production. And the goal of my presentation, this session, is first to get you excited about it, and second is to show you that there is already a pragmatic solution, or a solution you can already use today, which is a different approach to a front-end web application. Now, in a way, I will start by putting my money where my mouth is and saying that I'm not going to just show you all the different features and nice stuff about Elm, but rather start with saying that we in Gizra decided to go in production after 3.5 years with Angular. We jumped over React, and we decided to use Elm in production because it allows us to create more easily stable web application. Now, we have lots of different JavaScript frameworks out there in the world. They all have something in common. They're all written in JavaScript. And you can agree or disagree, but in my point of view, JavaScript is in a way problematic. Now, if you're a JavaScript ninja, good for you, but JavaScript in a way is like getting root access to the server. It's a bit too powerful, and you need to be very, very disciplined in order not to have different mistakes. So why have it in production? I would say I'd like to give the pragmatic approach. We're able to build web application quicker, cheaper. We're able to have a solid web application. And also very important, we are able to keep our developers' morale high. So in this session, I'm going to bash Angular 1 a bit, just because it's so easy and everybody loves to hate Angular 1 by now. But this is not in order to say it's either Angular 1 or Elm, but rather to show how Elm provides us different tools, different mindset in order to approach building web application. So very quickly, our evaluation process, which itself has been quite quick. We've started with our Office time watch, nothing too fancy. Probably in terms of technological stack, this is way over-engineered to what we need to have, that every employee can come to the office and just register that they got in and they got out. And then after that, we've decided that we want to build a typical web application, a similar to web application to the ones that we used to build in Angular. And very quickly, we found out that we're actually building a web application that is actually way more solid and way more fun building than our production web application. So it has logging, normal login, a login with GitHub, and leaflet maps, and routing, and page not found, and creating forms, and drag and drop files, and whatnot. And even specifically for this presentation, I've created another web application with new version of Elm that you can go and see in this URL. Again, nothing too fancy. It's just providing you a form, but you can do some kind of a login. It's not really a login. You provide either any username on GitHub. If it exists, then you'll get some kind of a routing. You can go to my account or page was found and whatnot. So this is one of the things that I hope if I'll be able to get you excited after you go into the, to the basic stuff, reading the excellent guide of Elm, then you can dive into this web application, which is, it's small, but it already shows you how we are building web applications that are serving us in production. So what is Elm? Elm, first of all, is a language. It's a compiled language, it's typed, it's immutable, it has no side effects, and it has no runtime errors, which is a pretty powerful guarantee coming from long years with JavaScript. So we have the Elm language. On top of that, we have the Elm architecture, which is basically a set of best practices. In a way, you can say that it's kind of a framework coming with its own language. The Elm architecture, it's very opinionated. It's telling us how to structure our application, how to connect different components. If we know this MVC, model view controller, in Elm architecture, we have this model update and view. And basically, it consists of a few principles. And actually, I've copied those principles from Redux. If you're familiar with React and Redux, Redux is actually heavily inspired from Elm. So the first principle is the single source of truth. And when I saw it for the first time, it really resonated with me. Because again, Angular 1 developers, if I would ask you, where do you hold the state of your application? You probably scratch your head and you'll think, well, maybe it's in the router, right? You are writer, but actually, I have services, and each service might have its own cache, and with the async nature of JavaScript, it's very hard to know what is the condition of the web application. So the first principle of the Elm architecture is saying our entire state is being held in one big object, in one big record tree. And this means that we are able, if we have bugs, we are able to replicate those bugs very, very easily because there is one single state. And it might sound a little counterintuitive, you know, separation and of concerns and whatnot. Components are still separated. They just happen to sit in the same big object. The second principle is state is read-only. Folks, it's 2016. We already know very well that the root of all the evil in this world, this heartwarming, positive, non-cynical world, is obviously two-way data binding. And if you're a bit like me, 3.5 years ago, I told a joke. If you are a bit like me, 3.5 years ago, I got into Angular site and I did the first example where I wrote my name and it said, hi, I'm Itai, and I was, oh my God, this is gonna save me so many jQuery lines. But obviously, that thing that made us love Angular so much is that thing that makes us hate it right now, because basically this MVC, with the two-way data binding, we're letting the view, our HTML, completely change the model without the controller having any say about it, which might cause different side effects. So when you hear about Elm, oftentimes you hear about all the fancy things, like you hear the word typed and immutable and time travel debugger and whatnot. But I want to show you what got me really, really excited the first time I saw Elm. Are you ready for that? Yeah? Back row? Ready? All right, there you have it. Oh, yeah. The counter example. As you can imagine, in the middle, we have a number, you can increment, and you can decrement. And what I want to show you is I want to show you the flow of how it's being done with Elm and the Elm architecture. I know the syntax is looking a bit daunting. Get over it. You're a bunch of developers. It's just syntax. So there is a bunch of, let me go there. There's a bunch of boilerplate I'm not going to show, but basically here we have the model counter, and I'm doing a bunch of imports. And then let's talking about the important thing. My model over here is very simple. And again, you don't need to understand every single, semicolon I'm going to show, just to understand the concept. So over here, I have a model which is just an integer, okay? It's a compiled language. It's a typed language, meaning I can no longer, it means I cannot send a string in. It is just a number. And when I'm going to initialize this model, it's going to start with 0. Watch me as I ever so gently completely ignore the init function because I'm so excited about these 3 lines. In fact, after explaining those 3 lines, I could have probably stopped the presentation because, again, Angular 1 developers, if I would ask yourself in your fairly medium web application, what are all the different actions, all the different interactions you are able to do with your model? Again, you'd probably scratch your head the same way I used to scratch my head. And even if you're a senior developer that you know the application very well, you need to go inside and start looking in the controller. You need to start maybe looking even in the HTML itself to understand who and what can change our model. But over here, we are very explicit. We are saying there is this type called message. It used to call action. Maybe conceptually, action sounds a little better, which is basically saying, I have this completely new arbitrary thing that I have that can change the model. That's decrement and increment, nothing more, nothing less. Basically, it's a compiled language, meaning I cannot get it wrong from here. The update function is kind of the brain of our web application. This is where the entire change of the state is going to happen. So if we're looking at the type signature, we're basically saying this update function, we get some kind of a message, increment or decrement. It's going to get a model. In our case, it's just an integer. And it's going to return a new model. I'm saying a new because it's an immutable language. I cannot, reassign variables over there. And there I'm going to say here, if I got it decrement, then it's model -1. Otherwise, if it's increment, model +1. I cannot have a typo. I cannot forget the word increment because the compiler will assist me. Next, we have the view. We have the view function. It might look it has some resemblance with HTML. It's not exactly HTML. It has the disadvantages and advantages. Disadvantages where our brain is more familiar with HTML, but again, I always like to say it is just syntax. The advantages, it's compiled, meaning I cannot have a typo. I cannot write div with an O instead of an I. I cannot forget closing a tag and so on. So over here, what we see, we have the div, and inside that, I have a button that on click will decrement. It doesn't mean it's really going to change the model. It's simply going to call the update function and say, hey, listen, take that model, which is now 0, and now decrement it. So now you know Elm. That's the beginning, the middle, and the end, kind of. And the nice part about Elm is basically whenever we are challenged with a certain problem, we start by modeling it, by literally thinking about how our model will look, how this type message will look. The update in the view are kind of just a side effect, kind of more of implementation details. So let's see an example of trying to model the example that we saw in the GIF earlier, what you can, fetch some data from GitHub and have a user. So over here, I've defined, you can see my stuff, yeah. I've defined a type alias, meaning I'm creating a new type that I call it a user. It has the record with avatar URL, which is getting a string, and a name that is getting a string. The avatar URL will be some kind of an HTTP URL, and the name itself. And under it, I have this view avatar function, which we can see that it's getting a string, and it will return me some kind of an HTML, which is basically saying, give me your URL, and I will make sure to render it as an image. So it looks fine, right? But, I was a little tired. It was very late in the afternoon, and I wrote this piece of code, which is basically calling view avatar, but it is passing it a string, which is not an HTTP, which means it's time for the slide, compile error versus runtime mistakes. So pay attention that I didn't write runtime errors, because there are no runtime errors in Elm. And by having this type system, we are trying to shift as much as possible runtime mistakes into compile error. Basically, we're trying to help the compiler understand what we want and thus assist us with building better web applications. So let's have a quick types 101. Here is the type Boolean as it is defined in the core of Elm. A Boolean can be either a false or a true. That's it. Here's another imaginary type, user type. Usually we have anonymous and authenticated. Here, just for the fun of it, we said the user type can either be anonymous, it either can be appending, which is actually wrapping an integer, an init, right? Meaning, let's say, the queue, where you are in the queue, or the authenticated, which will be wrapping, in this case, a string, maybe the username. So it's either an anonymous, which is just an anonymous, or it's either, let's say, authenticated, which is not just an authenticated, it's an authenticated wrapping another value, which happens to be a string. So looking back at our example where avatar URL and name are both string, we're able to actually define a new URL, which is actually a URL wrapping a string. We'll then be able to say that avatar URL is no longer of type string, it's of type URL. And this means that our view avatar will no longer receive just a normal string, it will receive a URL, which is basically a URL wrapping a string. I'm deliberately explaining it to you like that because it took me way too long, more than I'm admitting to tell you to understand this concept. So what we're doing over here in this view avatar, we're saying, okay, this URL, I have this URL inside, but it's already wrapped inside a type, so let me unwrap it over here, and then I'll be able to return it. And we actually even have a shorthand form of doing that. And this means that if I'm right now going to write this code and just pass it a normal string and not a URL wrapping a string, then you can see that the compiler over here integrated with Atom will tell me, listen, dude, you cannot do that. I was expecting you to pass me a URL, and you passed me a string. And basically, the likelihood of having bugs on production has just been reduced. But we can use something called the maybe values. And to better understand the maybe values, let's say that we're initializing our web application. And again, we have this user, but we just initialized the web application. We don't have a user yet. We didn't fetch anything from GitHub. So what are we going to do? So I'm going to say, OK, I have my user, and I'm going to create a function that is going to create me, initialize the user, an empty user, which is basically a bunch of nonsense, right? No name and no avatar URL. And now my model, I have, again, some arbitrary active page, which is just dealing with routing. But the user is of type user. So when I'm going to initialize the model, I'm going to say user is an empty user. But this is wrong, right, in terms of how it's going to, we're not modeling our problem right. We don't have enough metadata. What do you mean an empty user? It doesn't really exist. So for that, we are able to say this is not just a user, it's a maybe user. Meaning, we don't necessarily going to have a user. So I'll be able to say that instead of just user, it's a maybe user, and when I'm going to initialize the model, the user will equal nothing. And this is giving me a little bit better metadata, the fact that I still don't have a user. And if I would have a user, then it's just, right? That's the opposite. Either it's nothing, or it's just this record of a user holding the information. But as this slide is telling us, we can actually do better. And again, Elm really helps us thinking about problems with types. So this is a common pattern we're using in Elm, where we have this remote data. And now that you're all professionals with types, you already understand that I can actually map it and say, it's either going to be not asked, meaning I didn't even call the server yet. Maybe I'm loading because I'm in the middle of fetching. It's either a failure or a success. And this one is actually dealing not just with HTTP. It can be with WebSockets, getting stuff from local storage or whatnot. So we have a more specific web data that is basically saying it's remote data, and if there's going to be an error, it's going to be an HTTP error. Which means that right now I'm able to say in the model, the user is not just a user, it's not just a maybe user, it's a web data user. So when I'm going to initialize the empty model, then the user is not asked. So basically, Elm is kind of shifting, at least for me, the way I'm approaching problems. And it helps us to rethink how we would approach problems with types. And one of the problems that we had with one of our web applications was, how do we do translation? So there was actually a library in Elm that was kind of dealing with that, but it was missing type safety. And we came up with a nice solution for that is actually now being used by others, how to use type safety with translation. So I'm going to go very quickly over the idea over here. If you get it, good for you. If not, don't feel bad about it. Basically, I have a type language. Everything is completely arbitrary over here, English, Spanish, and I have this translation ID, which is kind of the ID that will be replaced with the long sentence. And by having everything in types, it's meaning that now, from this point onwards, the compiler will make sure I'm not doing any mistakes. So I have this translation ID for the logging and the welcome back, which will need to get a certain argument, which is a string. And over here in this translation function, then basically if I get the ID login, then the English is please log in, and the Spanish por favor haga login. And again, the compiler will make sure that there is no such case that, as we know it because we're using the internet, when you go to a certain language, suddenly a message is missing or is translated in the wrong language. But not everything is types, right? Type is very powerful, but we have other business logic requirements. Let's say, for example, that in our fabulous counter example, we cannot decrement below 0. So looking at a simplified counter example, we have the update, we have the decrement and the increment. The decrement right now is, we're just decrementing as we want. But obviously, update, this is the brain of our web application. Every change to the state is happening here, meaning also when we're going to fix bugs or write new functionality, we know exactly where it's going to happen. I'm just going to say, if the model is below 1, then it's 0. Otherwise, just decrement it. And obviously, business logic requires testing. So by a show of hands, who writes unit tests in JavaScript? Yeah, all right, good for you. And not a trick question, who enjoys it? All right, so for the viewers at home that cannot see, very few raised their hands, and I cannot blame them, because writing unit tests in JavaScript, in my opinion, you probably have the same amount of joy and happiness as those guys in the back of Kim Jong-un must be feeling. Unit tests in JavaScript, it is so much fun. And what makes unit tests so fun and easy in JavaScript is the idea of pure function and side effects. So let's have a quick talk about pure functions and side effects. So Elm is a black box. It has no connection to the outside world. The same way you're thinking about contacting your server, in the same way you need to contact the outside world to get the URL from the address bar, the current date, local storage, and whatnot. This is actually a side effect. So if we'll be looking at, again, a more advanced counter example where I need to get the information from the server, we're starting with the model and the type message. So the model, again, is an integer, and the update is saying fetch, fetch succeed, and fetch fail. And if you understand that we have those three, in a way you already understand the majority of things, because the rest will be just implementation details. We've just modeled our problem, and we understand that I can either, there are only 3 actions I can currently do. I can either fetch some information, and after fetching it, it either succeeded or failed. So in the fetch, what we can see, and again, there's a lot of things going on here, but what's important to understand is when we have this fetch action, then we are actually telling Elm, listen, whenever you're going to run this web application in the browser, I want you to perform some kind of a task, call some HTTP URL. If it's going to fail or going to succeed, call those action. But it's important to understand that there's no HTTP actually going on. It's up to the Elm runtime to do the HTTP request. It's just kind of a to-do for the Elm task, meaning this is a pure function. It's not going to call HTTP. It's not going to call local storage or whatnot. It's just, putting a tab on it and say, no problem, I'm going to do it later. And that's pure function, because I can call my function with the same argument. I will always get the same result. And in a way, on the same time, it kind of encourages us to be better developers, because on my Angular days, I would probably not deal with a fetch failure, because, hey, what can possibly go wrong? Why wouldn't an HTTP succeed? But the compiler, he forces us to do it because, a fetch must fail. A fetch might fail. And if I'm already writing the fetch fail, well, maybe I can go ahead and write a few more lines to make it clearer for the user. So I hope I was able to get you a little excited about it. If so, go ahead into the Elm into the Elm site and go into the awesome guide that it has. There are different tutorials out there in the Gizro blog as well. We have a Yo generator that basically scaffolds the sites for you that already comes with a nice structure and integrated with Travis and whatnot. So you can go over there, and also the Elm single page application that I've showed earlier. So that's the end of that presentation, and just for the last slide, I read somewhere that a good presentation should always end with a motif that was used in the beginning, and a quote. So if I may, I'd like to quote Cameron Diaz, and it's quite incredible because I feel that the quote really encapsulates really well this session. I would kiss a frog even if there were no promise of a Prince Charming popping out of it. I love frogs. I'd lick him. Thank you very much.